Today we have Mark Raffan as our guest on Coming to the Table, and I'm very excited because Mark is coming from the procurement side, and procurement is not something we've been touching so much upon on this show. So Mark is a thought leader within this area, and is on top of that running a very successful podcast by the name of Negotiation Ninja, which I personally think is a great title. So welcome, Mark. I'm so happy having you here today. Could you introduce yourself just very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me, Kelt, and hello to all the listeners and the viewers. Yeah, background is all in procurement negotiations, sales negotiations. Spent most of my career on the procurement side of the table, and then eventually decided I got very bored with the corporate world and decided to start my own thing. And so now we run a training coaching company that focuses on procurement and sales negotiations. And obviously a big part of that is evangelizing good procurement, good sales, and good negotiations practices. And we do that through our podcast and our blog.
Oh, great. Do you see a big difference between negotiation on procurement side and on sales? Or it's basically the same thing, just with different names on it?
I think it's fairly close. I think it's pretty much the same thing. The strategies are the same, maybe different, but the strategies are essentially the same, right? I mean, we need to try and assess the needs and wants of the other party on either side of the table, and we need to understand whether or not there's going to be a win
Mm.
for both parties. And that sort of leads me into another thing. There's a lot of people who would say that, to drive for win-win negotiations, and I think that's slightly misleading. There are going to be people who get more value than the other side of the table. There's going to be someone who may get more value, so I tend to try and steer towards something that says more mutually beneficial than a win-win, because you may get value, but it's still mutually beneficial, even value.
Right. Mark, what is a negotiation for you?
Really good question. I mean, like, the textbook definition of a negotiation is a discussion that leads to an. I think that's really underserving what negotiation is. In mind, a negotiation is a conversation where more parties build and divide value. Now, you don't necessarily, the textbook definition of a negotiation, it says it leads to an agreement. That may not necessarily be true. You may have a negotiation and you may not come to an agreement. You may actually walk away from the table. You may walk away from a deal. So I think we should not get confused to say that negotiation leads to agreement. It may not.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. A difficult question, or perhaps it's an easy one. Are we good at it, Mark? Us, you and I, and human beings in general?
That's a really difficult question. I think we can be good at it. I think it's like any skill. If you it enough, and if you actually implement the skills that you read about, that you learn about, you can be good at it. There are certain people, certainly, that are more predisposed to being good at negotiation, but that's the same as natural athletes, right? There are more athletic than other people.
Sure.
But if those people don't practice their athletic skills, they don't stay fit, then the people who work hard are going to end up doing better than them. So yes, I think we have the ability to do well at it, but there are people who are more naturally predisposed than others.
Right. Mark, you run a very successful podcast on negotiation. I think it's one of the more known one of those that are out there. What got you started with a show like that?
I was getting really bored. I was getting really bored in the corporate world. I started off actually writing a blog that started getting some traction, and that was sort of my creative outlet.
Right.
Then I was in the pub with a few friends, and we were having a few beers, and one of the friends said to me, well, you should start a podcast. And I said, well, I can't start a podcast. I don't have any time. I have a full-time job. I've got kids. I have a family. This is something that I just don't have the time to do. And then I had a few more beers, and it sounded like a great idea. So that's when I made a decision to start the podcast. And that's, that was just over a year ago. So we're 76-ish episodes in, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And it's been an incredible journey.
Yeah. Is there any specific advice? Is there any specific idea or creative input that you got from any of your guests that stands out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had the good fortune, just like yourself, of having amazing guests on the show. And one of the people that I idolize in the negotiation world is Herb Cohen, who wrote an amazing book in the 80s called You Can Negotiate Anything. One of the things that he says, and he said on the show, is breakdowns are potential breakthroughs.
Mm-hmm.
Just because things have stalled in the negotiation, or maybe someone's walked away from the table, it doesn't mean that the negotiation has to be over.
Yeah.
Maybe, and then he goes on to say, maybe if someone dies, right? Like then maybe it's over.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be over. There's always ways to revive the negotiation. There's always ways to pivot, to change something, to freshen something up, to bring in a new party. Don't let down stall the negotiation. They could potentially be breakthroughs.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good piece of advice, isn't it? I actually never heard that before. I really like that one. That's very good. You shouldn't name any names on my next question, but what is the worst thing anybody ever told you on the show? Have you ever been sitting there listening to your guest and just, shaking your head thinking that this is horrible?
Yeah, I edit those out actually. One of the worst things I heard on the negotiation was about the use of anger in negotiation, and I'm a big believer of like emotions are okay, but just don't let your emotions control you. You need to control your emotions.
Yeah.
Guest said once that it's okay to get really angry and slam your fists on the table and all that kind of thing because you need to send a certain message to the other party.
Right.
And I kind of disagree, and I can't agree. I mean, if it's a tactic and you're using it consciously and objectively to derive certain results, maybe it's okay. But if you're letting your emotions control you in that circumstance, then it's not okay.
But I guess that also illustrates that there's so many ways on how we perceive negotiation. Isn't that true? I mean, 2, 3, 4 people don't necessarily see negotiation as the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what negotiation is and what negotiation isn't. I think the media has done us a disservice. You watch Boiler Room or Wolf of Wall Street and those types of movies, and you see, it almost seems like a gunslinger's paradise where you shoot and then ask questions later, right? And that's, I mean, that couldn't, in my mind, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
And I think the vast majority of the population views negotiation that way. Maybe people who don't work in it on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate thing, is that they're being taught by movie stars, not negotiation professionals.
Right. That's a very good comment. Personally, Mark, what is the most interesting negotiation you yourself have been involved in?
The most interesting and the most complex negotiation I've ever been involved in was where I was negotiating a construction mining contract that had basically, the negotiation had lasted several months, almost over a year, hundreds of millions of dollars, lots of risk on the line, a lot of environmental complexities that had to be taken into account. And the reason it was the most interesting and the most complex is just because there were so many factors. There were so many inputs into the negotiation. We weren't just negotiating with the party that was going to provide services. We were, of course, negotiating with environmental bodies, governmental bodies, to ensure that everything was going in the right direction. And make sure that everyone got something mutually beneficial out of the deal. And so when you're trying to manage the egos that exist behind certain government positions and certain sales in different companies, it becomes challenging. So trying to manage those egos and manage the complexities within that in terms of the risk distribution was very.
Right. I guess very often when you read stuff about negotiation and view experts talking about negotiation, it's very often down to one negotiating towards another party. But I'm just getting inspired by what you said right now, Mark, because in real life, just as you mentioned, a lot of negotiation is with several parties, right? You might have three, four,
That's
five,
right.
six parties around the table. And obviously that just makes it more complex and more complicated than if you're just sitting across the table with one part. How would you attack a negotiation differently when you have mutual parties versus just sitting across the table with one party?
That's a big question.
I know.
I suppose this sounds like a terrible answer, but I would say it depends. It
Mm,
depends on the parties themselves. If you read David Lax's great book, 3D Negotiation, he talks about the third dimension of negotiation, which is setup, really, of
yep,
how
yep,
you involve all the interdisciplinary parties that are
yep,
going to be involved in it. How do you leverage the information? And so
yep,
before you even enter the
yep.
negotiation, if it's multi-party, my recommendation would be to get a very clear understanding of all the different parties, what their needs and wants are,
Mm-hmm.
like what their actual interests are
Yeah,
versus what you perceive to be their interests,
yeah,
and then start negotiating.
yeah.
Because if you go in negotiating with, for example, one party where you think, that's where the main deal is going to take
Mm,
place, and then you try and deal with the other stuff later,
mm.
you're setting yourself up for failure.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about the future, Mark, because I've talked to a lot of experts within artificial intelligence and similar area that claims that within the next 5, 10, 15 years, perhaps, we will see that artificial intelligence system will compete with human beings on how we negotiate and even negotiate better than you and I would negotiate. How do you see the future if we start talking about procurement? Do you think procurement in 10 years from now is replaced by a bunch of computers that will be sitting there negotiating with each other?
Okay, so this is a big conversation in procurement right now because the speed of technology implementation in procurement is going rapidly.
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
machine learning and artificial intelligence are playing a very big part in procurement and negotiation on a whole. There are bots right now that actually negotiate on your behalf on
Yep.
simple negotiations.
Yep.
So, for example, cell phone contracts is a big thing.
Uh-huh.
When you negotiate your cell phone contract with a messenger bot,
Uh-huh.
on whoever you have your cell phone contract with on the internet, you're
Mm.
not negotiating with an actual person. You're
Mm.
negotiating with an artificial intelligence.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
And
Mm.
so when we get to the point where a complex negotiation takes place
Mm.
by AI, I'm not sure when that will be, but certainly I think there is a possibility where negotiations could be done by an artificial intelligence.
Mm. Yeah.
I just don't know when it is. I
Yeah, I
wish I
know.
did. I
Yeah.
mean, there are companies right now that are working on this problem
Mm.
as we speak.
Mm.
Um, Matt Dixon, who co-wrote a great book called The Challenger Sale, is now head of product at a company that is working on developing an AI, a conversational AI that takes all the communications, all the interactions, all of the customer service questions, all the negotiations for many different companies, and they're
Mm.
actually working on making it conversational. So you would never know
Yeah,
that
exactly.
you're actually speaking to an artificial intelligence.
Yeah, no,
Now, the
exactly.
key there, of course, is your data has to be perfect for
Yeah.
that to work.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's never going to work. So when a lot of
Mm.
people talk about artificial intelligence, they don't think about the progression to get to that point. And your data has to be perfect. All of your
Mm.
processes have to be perfect.
Mm.
Then your machine learning has to be brilliant. And
Mm.
then, only then can you do artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So
Right.
there are companies that are going to get there faster than others and
Mm.
leapfrog.
Mm.
Are we there yet as a society?
Mm.
Maybe we're 10 years away. Who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah. But there's no doubt in your mind that that's the direction we're heading.
I think so, yeah. For simple negotiations, absolutely. For more complex legal negotiations,
Mm.
maybe not so much. I mean,
Mm.
the truth is that algorithms make better decisions than people because
Mm.
people get emotional, right?
Yeah.
So if you read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking
Mm.
Fast and Slow,
Mm.
he very clearly lays out that people are not as objective as they think they are because
Sure.
they're subject to
Yeah.
cognitive bias,
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas algorithms aren't.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, no, yeah, I completely agree. That leads me on to the next topic, which is basically emotions, because I want to talk a little bit about trust. Trust is one of the areas I research a lot within the field of negotiation, so that has my core interest. And how do you see the importance of trust in a negotiation, regardless what kind of negotiation we might be talking about?
Again, I think it depends. I think if you're managing a relationship and this
Hmm.
is a relationship that you want to continue,
Mm,
and there's no and you're sure that you want to continue that relationship, I think trust is obviously essential. You
mm,
have to have trust in
mm,
each other.
mm,
And then, as I've learned from you in your work, we can actually start to measure
mm,
the return on trust,
mm,
which is kind of
mm,
interesting to me.
mm,
If it's a purely transactional negotiation where
mm.
you're never going to interact with that person again,
Sure.
and that person has no sway on your reputation,
Yeah.
then trust is not a big deal. But I
Yeah.
mean, how many negotiations do you actually enter into where that
Mm,
actually occurs?
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would say the need for trust is
Mm,
big.
right.
And then we get into the cultural dynamic where different cultures trust differently.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
depending on which country you're negotiating within, trust may be a bigger or a smaller role in your negotiations.
Yeah. Talking about cross-cultural issues, what is your opinion about a big topic or important thing when we're talking about cross-cultural negotiation? What is a key thing that we have to be aware of besides trust?
I think just insight and empathy are a really big part of cross-cultural negotiations. I
Mm,
mean, it goes as simple as it sounds. It goes as far as greetings, right?
mm-hmm,
If you greet someone one way in North America and then greet someone in Japan
mm-hmm,
another way,
mm,
you may offend someone a great deal in Japan. For
mm,
example, a handshake
mm,
and tossing a business card on a table
mm,
is fine in
mm,
North America. But if
mm,
you do that in Japan,
mm,
I guarantee you are going to offend the Japanese person because
mm,
the business card is an extension of who they are.
mhm,
So they will literally hand you their business card with two hands.
mm,
You need to receive it with two hands,
mm,
review that business card, and
mm,
then very carefully put
mm,
it on your notepad.
mm,
Don't put it into your pocket because
mm,
that's a sign of disrespect.
mm,
Make sure that you're paying attention to greetings. And so I think as long as you have insight into that culture and you're doing your research
mm,
to determine how they interact,
mm,
negotiate and interact as they would
mm.
in their country.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, if they're here, obviously they need to abide by the rules that are placed in North America.
Right.
But if you're there, be a decent human being and
Right.
just approach them as you would in their country.
Right. What's your experience, Mark? Obviously, in the West, we have access to the information. We can prepare ourselves. We can study on different behaviors around the world. And we often have a tendency, just as you said, and I completely agree with you, but we have a tendency to tell people you have to obey to the rules and culture understanding of the area you're going to. But a question to you, and I should really ask the other culture, but the question is, do you think they prepared themselves as well to go and meet people in North America, or are they just arriving with their own culture, expecting North Americans to behave accordingly?
Oh, good question. I, I don't know. I suppose it would be based on the culture that would be coming here. I mean, if you're going to be negotiating with someone who's Japanese, I guarantee you they're doing the research.
Mm, mm,
Absolute, no question are they
mm.
doing the research.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, Other cultures, I guess it would depend on that culture and depending on how strong they may feel
yeah.
in the negotiation. And maybe they feel like they have the most leverage and so they
Right,
don't necessarily have to do the research. Who
right,
knows?
right.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a dangerous place to be for us specifically. So if anyone from any other cultures are listening to this, even in North America,
Mm,
don't get arrogant,
yeah,
right? You think you've got the most leverage,
yeah.
but you may not have the most leverage. And even if you do have the most leverage, if
Mm,
you insult someone unknowingly, you
mm.
could scuttle that entire negotiation.
Oh,
And then what are you going to do? Where are you going to
yeah,
go to?
yeah,
As long as you
yeah.
have a good BATNA, maybe you're in a good place.
Mm,
But
yeah,
ideally, you're
yeah,
hopefully going to do a
yeah.
deal with that primary negotiation.
Right. What could be a big cultural clash between a Canadian and a person from United States?
This is a good question because the rest of the world thinks we're very similar,
Hmm.
and I think to a large To a large degree, we are very similar, but there are a few things that make us very unique. Canadians are very accommodating. Um, Canadians are very kind, very generous, very patient people, and we are very careful not to offend anyone, to a fault, and that's probably a big downfall for us. Um, and that's probably the biggest area where we're most different, is that we will go out of our way to accommodate someone and not to offend someone.
Right.
Whereas I think Americans are very classically American in that it's like, hey, we're friends, we can do business, let's get things done. And that's beautiful. That's the amazing thing about the United States, in that it's assumed that we're going to get along. And so we don't need to worry about offending each other. And whereas Canadians, I don't think necessarily make those assumptions. We just are very careful when we first meet.
Right. Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because I guess there's a lot of Americans and perhaps even Canadians that just cross the border and think it's just going to be like negotiating with my neighbor here, and it could actually be very, very different.
Yeah. It likely is going to be very different. I think maybe on a person-to-person level, it's fine, but when you start to see large organizations negotiating with each other, the cultures are very different.
Oh yes, absolutely. Do you think some cultures in the world are just better at it? Do you think there are any nations, any cultures that are just better at negotiation than others? And in that case,
Absolutely.
who would that be?
Arabic cultures are brilliant. Like, I think they're just naturally prone to being better, maybe not necessarily like better holistic negotiators, but certainly better borderers. Like they're just they're growing up with it. Indians, like people from India, are brilliant entrepreneurs and negotiators. I would say that Eastern Europeans are actually really good negotiators because they're very firm.
Yeah.
They know what they can and they cannot do. I would say those three cultures are really big. Indians specifically, I think Indian people are naturally brilliant negotiators.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Just to wrap up, I have a couple of questions left, Mark, that I think could be very interesting to look into. And one of them is, do you think leaders make better negotiators?
No, I don't.
Right.
Not necessarily. I mean, maybe they do, but just because you're a leader doesn't mean you're a good negotiator. Just because you're in a position of power doesn't mean you're a good negotiator. In fact, it might mean that you're a bad negotiator because you're more tied to a certain result. And so you have confirmation bias. And so you look for information that supports an already pre-existing belief because you're too emotionally involved in something. Specifically like family-built businesses where you're deeply involved in that business. Maybe you're the worst person to be negotiating that deal because you're emotionally tied to the outcome of that. So I think it really depends. I think, maybe large company Fortune 500 CEOs, maybe they're separate. But again, they've gotten to that point through different means. So that's a tough question. Again, a terrible answer, but I think it really depends.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. The reason I'm asking and been asking a lot of my guests is because I do find in my world that some, obviously not all, but some executives naturally just feel that they are an expert on negotiation. That's why they became an executive. And I slightly disagree sometimes. So I'm just curious about how you, as an expert in the field as well, would view that. Now, perhaps the most important question of them all, Mark, is the final one, and that is, if you should give one piece of advice to our viewers on the science of negotiation, what would that one piece of advice be that they should remember?
Don't discount the importance of decision quality.
Okay.
I think a lot of people try and separate the disciplines of decision quality and negotiation. But you cannot have a good negotiation without having good decisions that preface that negotiation.
Right.
So go into the negotiation for the right reasons, and make sure those are the right reasons before you go in there. I was just reading recently about the sunk cost fallacy and then the related escalation of commitment, where you continue to make a bad decision based on data that's old, and even though you have new data that suggests that continuing with these series of decisions is bad, you continue to do it because that's the way we've always done it, or we've already spent the money, so we have to. And that's a result of poor decision quality. So I would suggest that don't separate decision quality from negotiation. Ensure the decision is good first and then negotiate.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice. I think that's a very good comment, Mark. Thank you. I'm sure some of our viewers would love to get to know you more and follow your podcast. How can they get closer to you?
Yeah, so just search for Negotiations Ninja on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you download podcasts. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most prolific. And yeah, looking forward to any questions that anyone may have and looking forward to connecting. Thank you so much for having me on, Keld.
Thank you, Mark, for taking out the time. Thank you so much.